Okay, you babes of jazz, let's pick up the pace. Let's make the parties longer, let's make the skirts shorter. Let's all go to hell in a fast car and keep it hot.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for Mr. C's video review of the Roaring 1920s. Let's get started. Actually, before we jump right into the 1920s, let's put this scenario into a bit of context and review what was going on prior to the 1920s in the 19-teens. And basically, the big event, the major event that we studied, was World War I. And as we all know, America wanted to remain neutral and not get involved in this conflict. But after a turn of circumstances, by 1917, we entered the war in support of our allies. And by doing so, we actually helped our allies become victorious. One of the situations that occurred while our soldiers went over to the war is it created job vacancies. And women and African Americans were called upon to fill these jobs. This was a big social change for our country. And when the soldiers came back, they took their jobs back, but we'll see that what women and African Americans experienced during wartime work, this carries over into the 1920s. Also, there was great upheaval going on around the world, and America was very afraid and wanted to isolate. They did not feel that the sacrifices that they made during World War I had really paid off for them. So they pretty much had enough of the rest of the world and just wanted to focus and take care of themselves at home. So, as we look at the 1920s, I'm going to create an analogy for you. Let's look at this as if the 1920s was a great big party, and we're going to plan that party. You're going to be party people, and America is going to be party central. But what I want you to do for the P and the C of party central, I want you to also replace that and put in prosperity and change. These are two important concepts that occur through the 1920s and really are what allowed the 1920s to roar. Going off of all of that, we're going to create an essential question. And basically that is, what was the 1920s party all about? Who attended it? And equally important, who did not attend it? Alright, so every great party has its hosts. And our party, just like any other party, had three of them. They were the American presidents. We had Warren G. Harding, we had Calvin Coolidge, and we had Herbert Hoover. So the first host that we're going to discuss is Warren G. Harding. And there's basically just two things I want you to remember about him. One was he's very famous for his campaign slogan, and that was a return to normalcy. People really didn't know what he meant by the word normalcy, but whatever it was, they wanted it after coming off a very difficult time with World War I and the economic recession that they were going through from 1919 into 1921. So what he was offering sounded good, and they voted him into office. Also, his administration was known for scandal, and unfortunately the most well-known one was the Teapot Dome scandal. And the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, he was receiving bribes. What a bribe is when you receive money illegally for doling out political favors. And what Fall was doing is he was allowing companies to drill on the Naval Federal Reserve oil land in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. And it got its name because of the structure. It's a giant rock called Teapot, and it looks like a big teapot. So that'll help you remember that. Our next host is Calvin Coolidge, and actually he was vice president when Warren G. Harding passed away, so he took over as president and then was elected during the next term and served until 1929. He's really credited with much of the economic prosperity that America generated during the 1920s. This was due to his laissez-faire policy, laissez-faire meaning hands-off, government hands-off, no regulation in business or very little, and let it do what it needs to do, lowering of taxes for rich people so they can generate jobs and generate wealth. Following him, the next host was Herbert Hoover, and his most famous line was "a chicken in every pot and a garage in every car." This shows you how important the automobile was during the 1920s. We'll touch on that in a minute. But this was all about prosperity, but unfortunately the party has to come to an end, and it did right after President Hoover was elected into office, not too far after, and we really crashed. So He's best well known for this analogy with America's vicious hangover. Okay, we've done our host. Now let's do our guest list. We're going to decide who gets in and who is not getting in. So let's look at who's not getting in first. We have the Red Scare. Basically what that was in 1917, the Bolsheviks revolted in Russia and installed communism. And America was very afraid of this type of political system wreaking havoc with democracy and capitalism. So anybody who was a communist, anybody who had radical thoughts, there were a lot of anarchists at the time, were targeted. U.S. Attorney General Mitchell A. Palmer, he started these raids called the Palmer Raids, and he started rounding up any radicals that he could. He arrested thousands of people and then also deported hundreds back to their native country. So this was targeted towards immigrants. What started to happen was this whole feeling of nativism, and that's an important word for you to know. Nativism means uncomfortableness or opposition to immigrants. You favor people who are native born in your country. And because of this, government policies started coming up. In 1921, they created a quota, which is a specific amount or number of immigrants that could come in from each country. And then in 1924, it became even stricter with the National Origins Act. And this meant that only 2% of the population from each nation that existed in 1890 was allowed into the country in the 1920s. So that's a very small amount. And this was really targeted against people from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe. And to further example of this was that Sacco and Vanzetti, two gentlemen that were Italian immigrants, aka Southern European, shows what that controversy is, were put on trial for robbery and murder in Massachusetts. But there was a lot of controversy about it because they were professed anarchists, and people felt that they were being more put on trial for their political beliefs than they were for the crime that they committed, because there was really shady evidence. It wasn't very solid. This became a worldwide event. Media covered it all over the place. And it's still unresolved. People don't really know if these two gentlemen were actually guilty of the crimes that they were convicted of. They were convicted and actually executed in 1927. So, not coming to the party are basically immigrants, anarchists, radicals. There's also one other group that I want to mention that was actually here and should have been at the party, but they weren't. And I think of it as, do you guys know what the two saddest words in the English language are? They are, what party? And unfortunately, what party was being said by our own nation's people, the farmers. Great advances in technology, the tractor, plows, things like that. It really helped produce and mechanize the agricultural industry, and this allowed for increased efficiency and, unfortunately, overproduction. And when we had overproduction like that, what it did is created too much competition for crops, and the prices dropped. So all these farmers went into severe debt because they put in a lot of money buying up new land, putting money into capital to purchase all of these new machines, and they had a really rough go of it during the 1920s. So again, not invited to the party, immigrants, radicals, anarchists, and farmers. Now let's go back to our guest list, and let's focus on the people who were invited. And there are three main groups we're going to focus on: women, youth, and African Americans. With women, it was the 19th Amendment giving them the right to vote, suffrage, and this changed everything. It allowed them more freedom. There was also job opportunities as nurses, teachers, secretaries, filling all the office spaces. More women were starting to go to college now. And then also wives were starting to challenge their husbands and starting to push for more equality in the marriage relationship. The quintessential image of the modern woman during the 1920s was the iconic flapper. She was the rebel. She was the quintessential party girl. She had cut her hair short. She raised her skirt above her knees. She was showing more skin on her legs and her arms. She was carefree and fun. She smoked. She wore makeup. She drank. She danced. She had different views about sex than traditional women did. She was the most popular figure from the 1920s. If you see artwork or imagery, she is kind of the iconic image for that decade. The next group that experienced a great deal of social change during the 1920s was youth. A lot more kids were going to high school. A lot more kids were going to college, both male and female. But the biggest change for youth was the use of having the automobile. And what this did was this allowed them to travel, to group together, to, most importantly, get away from parental supervision. So kids were partying, kids were doing different things that they did when there was a chaperone hanging over their shoulder watching every move. They also got crazy into fads, especially in college, and kids were flagpole sitting and doing marathon dancing. So this was a big time of change for them as well. The final group I want to mention for being invited to the party was the African Americans. We're going to go into more detail in the next section, but to start off with, the biggest change, there wasn't a great economic change, unfortunately, for the African Americans, but there was an incredible change for expressing a creative voice. And this is expressed through the Harlem Renaissance. But for our party theme, I've decided to label that entertainment, and we're going to cover all of that, and you'll see why in just a moment. But the main thing I want to mention here now is the one thing that does fit under who was invited here to this party is that the African Americans, with new job opportunities opening up in the North, it really allowed them to move up out of the South and come into northern cities to work in factories and relocate. And this great migration to the North allowed African Americans to congregate in a section of New York City called Harlem. And this is what led to the Harlem Renaissance.